So we're here today to talk about visibility. And as we heard this morning as well from Martin, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, we've seen a lot of disruptions, right? And logistics has always been complex, although I don't think people always appreciated that. 25 years ago when I started, people said, Bart, why are you going into logistics? What are you thinking? Now when I ask that, or when I say that, people never ask that question anymore, right? They go like, you're in logistics? That's super cool, that's what we need. But obviously disruptions have continued to multiply. And it's not just with the pandemic. We saw disruptions already increasing way before with things like trade wars. Obviously the pandemic started 2 years ago. Unfortunately, many of us would have thought by now we would have gotten rid of it. But as we see what's happening in China with lockdowns, it's still here. It's not going away anytime soon. But we're seeing now other things, like the war in Ukraine. We're seeing high gas prices, right? The highest we've seen in a long time. Even in Texas, where normally gas is so cheap, we see diesel prices over $5, and same here in Europe. And then weather-related disasters are continuing to increase as well and not going away. And especially in logistics. If you look at the whole supply chain, we've always had things going on supply chains. I was with PepsiCo for 10 years when commodities went up like oil or potatoes or grains, etc. Big issues, but now it seems to really be logistics that's getting the brunt of these disruptions, and so there's a lot of focus on it. And a lot of people are talking about it, and 25 years ago, people would have asked, you're in supply chain, what is supply chain? Or what is logistics? Well, you don't have to explain that anymore because it's in the media. And not just on the news, you see it in shows. I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with this global artist, Jack White, but his tour in 2022, he called it the Supply Chain Issues Tour. And I kind of jokingly said that's when he goes in front of the audience and it's just him with an acoustic guitar because his truck or the container with all the equipment is probably held up somewhere in the port when he's traveling. But what does that really mean, right? All these disruptions are happening. Maybe it's not new, maybe it's not something that companies say, well, we have seen this before. But how companies are reacting to it and the impact they have at it, especially on the supply chain side, is quite different. So if you look at it, disruptions are becoming a real threat to countries and supply chains, right? And the last 2 years, as I mentioned, it was mainly the pandemic. But now it's disruptions since the end of last year that have taken over from the pandemic as the #1 highest risk to growth. And again, that's on a country-by-country scale, and that's definitely also the case with supply chains. And it's not going to go away. The United Nations just brought out a study that says by 2030, the amount of disasters is going to go up by more than 25%. So we see big disasters today, around 400 of these events. By 2030, that's going to be around 560. And 80% of those are weather-related. So let's say we fix the war in Ukraine. We fix COVID. We fix the high fuel prices. I don't think we can fix the weather, right? So we have to understand that these disruptions will continue to hit us. And what does disruption really mean for organizations? Well, it means that your whole organization, all your functions, but end-to-end supply chain has just become more complex. Most companies see increased complexity in their supply chains. And what does that also mean? It's more contextual. Meaning you have to get a lot more data to understand really how to act and react to these disruptions. It's a lot more continuous, meaning it's no good anymore to get some KPIs and statistics after the fact. You need to get real-time data to be able to put you in a position to react to it. And it's more connected, right? A supply chain, it is a chain. You need to be able to connect and get data from your customers, from your suppliers, from your logistics service providers, from the government, from ports, etc. So it's quite different than what we've seen before. And if you ask, and this is from a Gartner survey, if you ask people, what is the areas that you've seen the biggest risk and where you had the most effort in managing risk, they'll all say it's logistics and it's logistics costs. And last week I was in Rotterdam at a sustainability event, and there was someone there from PepsiCo, and they said, you know what, in 2021, the actual cost for transportation was twice what we had originally budgeted. So obviously, when you experience that, we're seeing these huge reactions. And the market drivers aren't seem to improve at all, right? We see demand going up. Now, the economy slowed down a little bit the last 2 months because of the war in Ukraine. And we see also because of higher fuel prices that the basically the income that people have, they're spending less on other things. So we've seen it weakening a little bit, but overall demand's still up. But then supply's down. Whether it's inventory of products being down, there's less manufacturing going on, there's definitely less products getting shipped from China, and all of that increases risk. And then we're seeing still across all modes of transportation across the globe, these huge prices for transportation. So that's kind of setting the level of why is it that people really start to care about technology and what they do differently to react to these different trends out there. And then logistics is another part that, to be honest, has never followed some of the other trends in supply chain. If you looked at manufacturing, they've been implementing technology and automating things for the last 20 years. If you're doing supply chain planning, people understand they need to plan, they need to get access to data, they need to automate certain processes. But yet, transportation, it's almost like it stood still in time. There hasn't been that same reaction to implemented technology. And when I was working here in Holland in the 90s, and we were starting to improve these processes, and slowly but surely we were starting to implement transportation technologies like TMS, or vehicle routing systems, or telematics. We were some of the first to do that at the organization. And back then, that wasn't a normal thing, and it would take another 20 years for some of these systems to become very democratized, so a lot of companies would have access to them. And as a result, you really see that the supply chain, especially in the areas that transportation is involved, and obviously transportation touches inbound product coming in, or movements from a factory to a DC, or it's going to a customer or to a store. We've seen that in different areas, we see issues with people just not having the right information. I'm not going to go in detail about all of them, but what you see in common is that there's lack of data, lack of high quality data, and really lack of the insights people need to make the right decisions at the right time. And hence we've seen that as a top priority of what people do to manage risk is to implement supply chain visibility. It's at the top of the list. And that's why we've seen the last 3 to 4 years that visibility market growing so fast. And in all honesty, that's what attracted me to the visibility market when I was at Gartner. When I saw all this stuff happening in logistics, where I go, like, I had to wait 25 years in my career to get to the point where logistics, all of a sudden, it's kind of the focal area, and there's so much happening, where I said, I want to dive back into the industry rather than as an advisor sit on the sideline. And what's the area where we see the most movement is visibility, and that's really why I ended up joining Project 44. And so as companies are also starting to mature at this time, because we've seen a lot of companies do more digital transformation in the last 2 years than they've probably done in the previous 5, it also improves their maturity. And as they're increasing in maturity, they're also going to look at things like visibility differently. Instead of saying, well, we want just pure transportation visibility, a lot of companies are starting to focus more on what we call end-to-end visibility, to say we need data across the supply chain. And then the other point is, when you're at a higher level of maturity even, you're looking at what we call multi-enterprise supply chain visibility, meaning I don't just want to collect all the data of the things that I organize and I manage, but I also want to go and reach out maybe to my supplier for delivered freight, but still get that inbound visibility. I want to get more information from my other partners. And that's where we're seeing that evolve and at different stages. So it's important to understand that not everyone's necessarily at that same stage using visibility in the same way. So what is important in how they really use visibility and why they should use visibility? Well, the fact is now visibility is really at the heart of supply chain execution. And again, as I mentioned before, when I started, we thought the most important part was to use like a TMS and plan and optimize transportation. But then very soon after, we understood that the way it's being executed, that we had lack of visibility to how it's being executed. And even when we collected the information, for example, from the private fleet, that it really wasn't in line with what we thought we were doing when we were planning it. So visibility is kind of that layer that provides you information for what's been for a long time that kind of black hole. And that's really what Project 44 is doing. It's creating the connective tissue in the supply chain to connect all of the different players in that supply chain, whether it's a manufacturer with a customer, with a 3PL, with a supplier, to connect all of these different companies together, to pull all of the data, to obviously initially provide more visibility, but you need to do much more than that as well and do that data at high quality. So with these disruptions, yeah, visibility has always been important. Back in the day, you got an EDI message at 2:14 to say, hey, the truck's arrived. Or like a lot of companies would deliver something, give you an example, 4 o'clock delivery, and at 6 o'clock it gets delivered. And at 8 o'clock you get that EDI coming in to say, hey, your delivery was done 2 hours late at 6 p.m. That's not good, right? And it's not always bad to be late, for example, for a customer, whether you're a consumer or a company. What's really bad if the customer doesn't have transparency to that. It's important to be able to say, if I can't control the process, that means you're not going to get your product on time because of inventory issues, or there's something happening in transit, or something happening because there's a delay at the loading or unloading. What I can do as a company, I can provide transparency to my customer and to keep my customer happier. But what we're also seeing, it's not just good enough to have that visibility. That's why we're seeing a lot of solutions that we're creating around things like port visibility. There's a lot of things happening in ports. There's a lot of disruptions there, or around capacity and understanding where's capacity available, where our trucks go in empty, and have companies have the ability to work around that. And then especially in Europe, we see a big demand around sustainability. And what we're starting to see is that visibility data is really that gateway to sustainability data, because the source of the data is also coming from your carriers, so we can collect a lot of that information, and then starting by measuring the carbon footprint, and then continue to work on the life cycle flow to optimize and help companies to decarbonize. But we've seen a couple of different trends in visibility. One of them is that companies, maybe they started with a single mode of transportation, a single region. We're seeing a lot more focus on all modes, especially oceans become a lot more important the last year. We see companies also kind of expanding in all regions, because now that they have a tool that they like in one region, they want to replicate that across the company, especially if you're a large global company. But the fact is, transportation is a big industry, right? There's a lot of different players, especially if you go from carriers, from air carriers to ocean carriers to trucking companies, full truckload and LTL. So it's also important to not just have a large network, but also work with partners that maybe have their own network, in some cases acquisitions. We acquired several companies last year, Ocean Insights, because they had 10 years worth of data, of ocean data that we wanted to have access to. We acquired a company called Clear Metal that had incredibly powerful capabilities around artificial intelligence, machine learning that we could layer underneath all modes. And then later in the year, a company called Convey, who was really doing that visibility, but more focused on the last mile side, because again, we want to capture it end to end. And then the other part is you need to be able to partner with technology companies that also are doing some of that planning or doing other things. So how do you connect to the ERPs of the world, the TMSs, the telematics organizations? And there we have over 1,000 partners worldwide, but we're also working with solution integrators, with consulting companies, even with universities. And part of my job is to also work around thought leadership. And so we're doing a lot of work with companies like McKinsey around, envisioning what the need is for the future, to future-proof supply chains. Or we're working with universities around things and topics like sustainability. So how do we attack that in the company? So we provide visibility, and that's where most of the companies start. They either do that for over the road, or they might start with ocean to provide that visibility, but be able to provide that to the customers in one single view. And we call that the Visibility Operations Center, where the customer has access to all of the data. So you want to be able to follow that if it's a multimodal move across all of the modes, and you want to do that at the level of the SKU item as well. We saw that, for example, last year with the incident at the Suez Canal. People knew exactly where all their containers were, but they couldn't tell which customers were affected because they couldn't get down to the level of the SKU. So that becomes very important as well. But at the same time, you need to be able to also visually provide that if needed, but you need to go down to the level of data that the customer needs. And that's really important as well, the quality of the data. We'll talk a little bit more about how quality of data and good analytics, what that means. And in order to do that, it's all based on the network. And so that's a little bit of difference between visibility and, for example, TMS. So people sometimes say, well, why can't my TMS provide visibility? Well, a TMS is an application, and most of these companies, what they focus on is creating application stacks which is quite different from what visibility is. And at Gartner, we call that real-time transportation visibility platform. And the difference is the platform, what it has is a network, and it collects the data. So there's obviously applications that you have, but those are a lot less important. What's really important is the network, because that's the source of where you pull the data from. And that's kind of where we're the leader. If you look across the modes, where we have access to the most data and the most partners across mode, and where we're doing that globally and continuously expanding at a global level. So now that we've established what that visibility is, how do you actually then go and use that data? And I think someone talked a little bit about data this morning. But if you look at the evolution of data, so right now, by end of 2022, we're expecting to have around 97 zettabytes of data. And I was talking at the University of Tennessee about that, and the professor goes like, Bart, did you just invent a new term? I didn't invent that, and I'm not going to claim I did. And you actually see what's crazy. The zettabyte is actually, it's 1 billion terabytes, right? I don't know if you can imagine that, but it's a lot of data. Now, that's not even the biggest. There's something called a brontobyte, which is 1 million times bigger than a zettabyte. So with the whole IoT over the last 10, 20 years, where we have sensors everywhere, for example, we have one of our partners here, Tive, that can put sensors on products and in vehicles. If you look at other IoT devices and sensors in trucks and in trailers and on ships, etc., in planes, we're collecting so much information. But it also means that it becomes very important to, one, make sure that all of that data you're collecting is good quality data. But you also need to understand which of those data metrics do I really want to capture, and which of those metrics are really of importance to me. Meaning, you want to provide data that can lead to insights, and those insights that then eventually can lead for companies to make the right decisions. So it's not good to just have a lot of data, because you're going from a problem from looking for a needle in a haystack to looking at a haystack full of needles, right? So it's very important to have the capability to distinguish what's really important. And that's where a couple of technologies have really risen to the top, and that's something we use plenty of, which is artificial intelligence and analytics. So also with some of the acquisitions that I mentioned, we had the good fortune to be able to increase a lot the number of data scientists that we have. So our AI usage on that data has become a key differentiator in the way we provide products and how we calculate things like estimated time of arrival or ETA. So machine learning is another part of that, or deep learning. And you have to understand, without necessarily needing to know the technical part of it, there's two things that you really need for machine learning to be able to be applied successfully. It's one, you need a lot of data. And so that's the difference between someone that has a lot of data versus a little amount of data. Exponentially, the quality of your insight goes up with machine learning, the more data you can let that on. And the second is time. And I always jokingly say, if you didn't need time, we would just call it machine doing. The learning part means that you need to have the systems, but also the time to collect the data. That's why day one, no one can say, I got perfect machine learning outcomes, because it does take time. But what we're seeing is more and more companies are starting to invest in some of these capabilities, and they're doing that all either internally, maybe some of the customers that might build their own control towers with that capability, but a lot of them actually use companies and partners to provide that capability. But the other part is to have more intelligence. So that's where it comes in saying analytics on its own isn't just good enough. You need to have an augmented level of intelligence, because that points to the real-time aspects of the data, but also have the intelligence to understand which of those data points are really important for your organization to, again, give you those insights that can help you bring those insights that lead to decisions that make your company more efficient. And again, that's where we're seeing is heavy focus on those different technology. But again, don't forget that it's not good enough to just have data. Data quality is becoming more and more important. And you even see that when you go to customers who thought, but Bart, we've had that data, right? We're getting visibility because we're getting some EDI 214s. Well, I saw a customer, and this was when I was still at Gartner, where they were getting EDI 214s. And then when they did an analysis afterwards, they understood that the EDI 214 was actually sent by the carrier right after they had their tender accept. And the reason was they needed to send an EDI 214 to get paid. So instead of providing them with real data and the actual need for a delivery confirmation, they just sent a message with a time frame in it just to get paid. So it doesn't mean because you get data, it's the right data. So it's important to have a mechanism to get that data and get it in real time, but also to have intelligence behind the data that can understand, is this actually a valid data point? And it's important because we're going to talk a little bit about what's next. When you start doing things like predictions, it is important that your data quality is good. Because if you're looking backwards and the data is bad, maybe it's not such a big problem. But if you're going to start making predictions or prescriptions based on bad data, that's when it goes bad. And again, we know that, for example, from supply chain planning. We've heard some people speak about supply chain planning today, and I was involved with some projects there as well, where you start doing like demand forecasting. Well, if the data isn't good, you're going to have very low forecast accuracy. So people continuously look at improving that data to then in turn improve the forecast accuracy. And again, that's where I would say we have a huge focus on, where we're continuously looking at the quality of the data to make sure that we have the learning algorithms that help with that we're using an API-first methodology, because API-first meaning that's going to give you the most real-time accurate data rather than pulling it through an app or something else, but then also continue to invest in these capabilities to provide more data, bigger network, more capability, more extensive capabilities across the lifecycle flow as well, but then continuing to provide better solutions. Now, where's the value coming from? So let's say you kind of start on your journey and you want to say, well, that's all good, but how do I convince my boss that I really need visibility? There's a lot of opportunity to create value from visibility. It can go from detention times going down. It can be higher ETA, which can help you, for example, with some of the people that get ODIF penalties. If you're in retail or providing to retailers, you're going to get a lot of ODIF penalty, whether you're early or late. Doesn't mean because you're early that's good. Same thing, you're going to get a penalty. But a lot of different areas. And so part of it is understanding what is the bottleneck right now. Where do I think I can get right to the value? But also, how do you build that up? Because you're not going to find all of that value day one. And that's the great thing, again, by visibility. It's not you start with something, you have everything, you build it up according to what I'll call in a minute the visibility journey. The other part is that it is truly the first true collaborative transportation technology. Again, if you look to some technologies like TMS, it's really something that provides value to a shipper, and then the carrier has to connect to provide information to that TMS, really for the shipper. There isn't much in it for the carrier. With visibility, everyone gets access to the data. Carriers have their own dashboard, other partners have their dashboard, and they're all getting different value propositions from being and using that visibility platform. So it's truly an area where companies can collaborate on and provide value across the board. But as I mentioned, this is a journey. It's not a one and done, but it's also got different layers. And as I mentioned before, is most companies start with one or a few modes. They're doing more of their basic analytics. And then as they go forward, they're starting to use more and more of that machine learning to get more of these predictive and eventually prescriptive analytics. And the goal is, and I'll say, honestly, most companies are still in phase one, probably 80% of the customers. Maybe 20% have gone to that phase two. And then phase three, which is kind of the Valhalla for most companies, would be to be able to then use those insights to start automating these processes. Now, most companies are not there. And it's not the technology, because we have a lot of technology that helps us automate. The problem is companies are not ready from an organizational perspective. If you go to a company and say, I can for sure automate this process, a company is going to say, no, I still want my guy to push the button, especially in transportation. That's still such a manually and human-focused. That's why the difference within logistics, between warehouse and transportation, people don't have an issue replacing a human in a warehouse with a robot. And so artificial intelligence there means you're replacing the human. But when we're talking about transportation, we're talking about augmenting the intelligence of the human. So you need to provide the capabilities that augment what that person is doing. So again, visibility is a journey. There's going to be a lot of left and right turns, a little bit like when you're using Waze. You start at A, you want to get to B. How do you get to that path, right? And you're going to know that you're going to change, but that's where the importance comes in of how do you start with the network? How do you then make sure you got the right data and high quality data? Then you're going to start building up the analytics to it and slowly but surely extend that as you mature, as you see more value coming from visibility, to one, to automate more of the processes, but also to add other capabilities to extend visibility in transportation, maybe into the yard, all the way to the dock door, where you're starting to do things like appointment scheduling at the dock, where you're starting to look at sustainability. So we're seeing a lot of our customers that started maybe one point, and now they're maybe at a point where they're doing a lot of more modes of transportation, doing that globally, and doing that across a lot more functions. But just to finish off, what we've really seen is that visibility has become one of those elements and one of those solutions that really has become a necessity in supply chains, because again, as the title said, if you can't see it and you can't measure it, then it's hard to manage. It's a little bit like a pilot flying a plane and he doesn't have any controls. He's not going to be able to manage that situation. So the importance of visibility really is helping organizations to become more digitally transformed, really helping them manage their way through disruptions and further on. So that's all I had. Hugo, I think it's back to you, but thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of the conference.